The throne room in Pella, autumn of 229 BC. An acrid smell of burning hangs in the air. The northern borders have been breached, and the fierce Dardanian tribes have flooded into the lands of Macedonia, destroying everything in their path. King Demetrius II, who tried to plug this breach, has been killed. Sitting on the massive ancient throne is a 9-year-old boy named Philip. His feet barely touch the stone floor. In the brutal Hellenistic ecosystem, where the right to rule must be proven with the tip of a spear, a child monarch means certain doom for the state. Surrounding him stand grim Macedonian aristocrats, veterans of past campaigns, and every single one of them understands the country is doomed. Fast forward 12 years, and this very same young man will ride triumphantly into liberated Greek city-states. Crowds will shower his path with flowers. Poets and orators will compose hymns, granting him the title of Eromenos, the beloved of the Hellenes. They will dedicate altars to him, seeing him as the living reincarnation of Alexander the Great. An image emerges of the ideal monarch, whose endurance, military genius, and magnanimity inspire almost religious awe. But another 2 decades will pass, and these exact same Greeks, who today are ready to lay down their lives for the young king, will be begging foreigners with tears in their eyes, Roman legionaries, whom they had despised for centuries as semi-wild barbarians, to come and subjugate them. The free Greek polis will choose the Roman yoke entirely voluntarily, pursuing only one goal: to be saved from Philip V. What exactly will happen in the dark alleyways of the once allied city of Macedon? How will this brilliant young savior reach the point of ordering the execution of his own innocent son? In one of our previous episodes, the Antigonids, War with the Gods, and the Birth of a Dynasty, we watched how this empire survived after the Galatian invasion led by Brennus. Antigonus Gonatas dragged the country out of chaos, binding it together with steel and stoic patience. It seemed that era of fragmentation was left behind forever, and Macedonia had found an unshakable foundation. But an empire does not begin to crumble on the day enemy battering rams break through its gates. It breaks from within, the very moment a ruler decides that governing through the fear of his subjects is far easier than earning their loyalty. You are about to look inside a royal bedchamber, where a loyal guardian sleeps with a drawn dagger under his pillow, protecting the peace of a boy king. You will hear the dying shout of a general who returned lost hegemony to his country and became the first in history to smash through the gates of impregnable Sparta. You will march in lockstep with the Phalangites during an unthinkable winter forced march that shattered every ancient conception of military logistics. And finally, you will approach the threshold where the Macedonian sovereign will clash with Roman legions for the very first time. Before us is not merely a chronicle of a reign, but an anatomy of how power burns away human reason. Our story begins exactly where any other should have ended, in total collapse, in the ruins of 229 BC. The year is 229 BC. A wind from the north carries the smell of ash into the Macedonian capital of Pella. The defensive line has been broken. King Demetrius II, who had held back enemy attacks for a solid decade, is dead. His army has been shattered by the Dardanian tribes. The state that once dictated its will to Asia has shrunk to the size of a few hastily fortified cities. In the center of the military camp, the Macedonian army assembly gathers. This is not the Roman Senate with its calibrated formal debates. Standing here are hardened veterans whose primary political argument traditionally consists of the rhythmic beating of spears against shields. They are the ones who approve new monarchs, and they are the ones who can strip them of the diadem. Right now, a new ruler is being led out before this sea of dust-covered soldiers. Philip, the only legitimate son of the late monarch, is just 9 years old. The boy stands before an army waiting for a warlord. In any other civilization, the death of a king and the passing of the crown to a child would mean a difficult but straightforward period of regency. But in the world built by the successors of Alexander the Great, a monarch is obligated to personally lead the phalanx into battle, proving his right to rule with spilled blood. A child on the throne is not a temporary crisis. It is an open invitation to partition the country. The veterans in the crowd still remembered the events of half a century ago. In 279 BC, the death of King Ptolemy Ceraunus in battle against the Galatians resulted in years of anarchy, where barbarians burned villages and plundered royal tombs. The Dardanian invasion felt like a terrifying repetition of that nightmare. Neighbors looked at Macedonia with anticipation. The Aetolians and Achaeans to the south were already dividing spheres of influence, while the Dardanians to the north prepared for a new thrust deep into their territories. The irony of Demetrius II's reign was that he had fought continuously to pass down a safe state to his son. In reality, he left the country stripped of its best shock troops, with an empty treasury and borders in flames. The Antigonid dynasty, which had once seized power from the chaos of the wars of the Diadochi, now teetered on the brink of extinction. The army assembly hums with tension. A crowd of armed men is physically unready to submit to a child who can barely hold a practiced sword. The clatter of spears grows louder, demanding immediate action. The country needs a defender, a grown general, capable of mounting a horse right now to stop the Dardanian horde. And Macedonia will get something more than just a crisis general. It will get a man whose single promise will forever change the destiny of the frightened boy on the throne. The royal bedchamber in Pella is plunged into darkness. 9-year-old Philip sleeps, while teenagers with drawn swords stand frozen at the doors. This is the institution of the Basilikoi Paides, the royal pages. The sons of the highest Macedonian nobility serve the monarch at the table and stand the night watch. At first glance, it is the perfect defense. In reality, the boy is sleeping, surrounded by potential assassins. These guards are the children of the very same aristocrats who, right at this moment, are carving up the crushed country in the back rooms. In 229 BC, the northern borders are breached. Following the death of King Demetrius II, Dardanian tribes are slaughtering the border garrisons. Into this chaos steps a man whose right to power is undeniable. The late monarch's cousin, 34-year-old Antigonus. The panic-stricken elite and the army hand him the reins of government. The rules of Hellenistic survival dictate a simple script. Quietly eliminate the child, declare yourself the sole ruler, and found your own royal line. But Antigonus does otherwise. He accepts the regency and immediately marries the predecessor's widow, Queen Chryseis, consolidating the fractured authority. He gathers the demoralized army, marches north at a forced pace, and drives the Dardanians back across the Macedonian borders, crushing a rebellion in Thessaly along the way. However, returning in triumph, he does not lay a finger on his nephew. For this, the people give him a strange, almost mocking nickname, Doson, he who promises. He publicly swore that he was merely guarding the throne until Philip came of age, and he intended to keep his word. This was not altruism. Doson proved to be a calculating strategist. Had he killed the boy, ambitious generals would have had the perfect pretext for a civil war under the banner of avenging the rightful heir. By sparing Philip's life, Doson legitimized his own dictatorship. He became an irreplaceable shield. Ancient contemporaries whispered that the regent moved his own bed into Philip's chambers and slept with a dagger under his pillow, personally protecting his nephew from the royal pages and their influential fathers. Doson gave the veterans a ruthless commander and the aristocracy an untouchable symbol of the dynasty. The state was saved. Young Philip grew up watching his uncle manage the incredibly complex machinery of the empire with an iron hand. Doson restored the northern facade of the state, but the peace proved short-lived. While a fragile peace reigned in the north, the south was rapidly plunging into chaos. Macedonian hegemony in the Peloponnese had evaporated. In Laconia, Sparta was beginning to gather strength once again. Under the leadership of the reformer Cleomenes III, Sparta challenged its neighbors and began sharpening its swords once more. To stop this threat, the Macedonian regent would have to march south and do something that even Alexander the Great had not dared to do in his times: smash through the gates of a city that had no walls. While Antigonus Doson was building a new defensive line in the north and guarding the peace of young Philip, a threat that hadn't been thought of for a century and a half began to re-emerge in southern Greece. Macedonian hegemony relied on the fragmentation of the Greek city-states. The Achaean League, which united the cities of the Peloponnese, had spent years expelling Macedonian garrisons from its lands. The Achaean leader, Aratus of Sicyon, had dedicated his life to a single goal: cleansing Hellas of the Macedonian presence. He had personally commanded the night assault that drove Pella's soldiers from Acrocorinth, the key fortress locking the entrance to the peninsula. Aratus believed that the Greeks would now determine their own destiny. But the real blow came from Sparta, and the very man who had spent 30 years fighting Macedonia would soon hand the keys to Acrocorinth back to a Macedonian king. Sparta, at the end of the 3rd century BC, resembled an open-air museum. Only empty rituals remained of the ancient laws of Lycurgus. Land had accumulated in the hands of 100 wealthy families, and the number of full citizens had dwindled to just 700 men. But in 235 BC, Cleomenes III ascends to the throne. He decides to return the city to its former glory, and he does so through force. Cleomenes murders the ephors, cancels all debts, confiscates land from the rich and divides it into 4,000 plots. He arms these new citizens with long Macedonian sarissas. Sparta transforms from an oligarchic relic into a state fueled by social revolution. Cleomenes leads his new army beyond the borders of Laconia. The Achaean League tries to resist, but suffers one defeat after another. At Mount Lycaeum, at Laodicea, where the Achaean general Lydiatus is killed, and at Hecatombium. Events unfold rapidly. The cities of the Peloponnese surrender to the Spartans without a fight, hoping for debt forgiveness and land redistribution. Panic breaks out in the assembly of the Achaean League. The politicians realize that their own populations are ready to open the gates to the enemy. And in Sicyon, the aging Aratus places his seal on a secret message addressed to the north. To Antigonus Doson. Ancient historians often accused Aratus of betraying the ideals of freedom. Why did a fighter against tyrants bow before a Macedonian monarch? Cleomenes III didn't just bring Spartan hegemony, he brought class warfare. To the wealthy Achaean landowners, a Spartan canceling debts and handing out land to the poor looked far more dangerous than any foreign king. Giving Acrocorinth back to Macedonia was like letting an armed mercenary into your home to save yourself from a raging fire. The house no longer belongs to you, but at least you stay alive. Aratus chose the political survival of his class. He agreed to return Acrocorinth, Orchomenus, and Herea to Doson, as well as to provision the Macedonian army. The deal was struck. Cleomenes, learning of the conspiracy, managed to occupy Corinth and Argos, hoping to lock down the peninsula. He built defensive lines at the isthmus, preparing to meet the Macedonians. But Doson had no intention of storming the Spartan barricades head-on. He reconstituted the old Hellenic League, uniting almost all of central Greece around Macedonia. Cleomenes found himself dragged into a war of attrition against the resources of an entire coalition. When an anti-Spartan uprising flared up in Argos, Cleomenes was forced to hastily retreat into Arcadia, abandoning his winning positions on the isthmus. The Macedonian army entered the Peloponnese unopposed. Doson brought cities to heel by his mere presence, acting no longer as an occupier, but as a legally summoned savior. Cleomenes, pinned down in the mountains of Laconia and stripped of financial support from Egypt, realized he had to force a pitched battle. The Spartan forces and the Macedonian phalanx would clash in a narrow valley where the fate of the entire peninsula would be decided. Summer 222 BC. The valley of the river Enos on the northern border of Laconia. The Spartan king Cleomenes III has blocked this narrow pass at Sellasia, hoping to lure the Macedonians into a trap. He has occupied two steep hills, Olympus and Evis, barricading the riverbed with trenches and palisades. His army numbers over 20,000 men. Cleomenes is confident. The Macedonians will have to launch a frontal assault up the slope, straight into the spears of his veterans. Antigonus Doson brings nearly 30,000 soldiers, the army of the reborn Hellenic League. In the center march the famous white shields and bronze shields, the elite of the Macedonian infantry, armed with long sarissas. Doson is in no hurry. For several days he studies the heights, searching for a weak point in the enemy's defense. The Spartan king calculated that these hills would become a graveyard for the Macedonian phalanx. But ultimately, they became the killing field of his own army. At dawn, the Macedonian right flank begins its assault on the hill of Evis, where Cleomenes' brother, Eucleides, is entrenched. The Illyrian and Achaean allies struggle to climb the steep slope. Suddenly, Spartan light infantry strikes from an ambush, attacking the advancing troops in their unprotected rear. The offensive bogs down. Dawson's soldiers find themselves squeezed between blows from above and from behind. The Macedonian cavalry commanders, standing in reserve on the plain, do nothing. They are waiting for the prearranged signal, a purple flag from the king. But the strict tactical plan is broken. A young Arcadian cavalryman from Megalopolis named Philopoemen sees that the allied infantry is on the verge of annihilation. He holds no high rank. He demands the commanders launch an attack, but they wave the inexperienced youth away. So, Philopoemen rallies his fellow citizens and unilaterally charges his cavalry straight into the center of the enemy ambush. In the brutal melee, his horse is killed beneath him. He continues to fight on foot until an enemy javelin pierces straight through both of his thighs. Yet his desperate charge gives the infantry precious minutes to regroup and drive the Spartans from the height. Antigonus sees the enemy's flank is crushed and raises the purple flag. Now it is the turn of the hill of Olympus. The Macedonian phalanx locks its ranks. A forest of 20-foot pikes slowly crawls up the slope. Cleomenes is forced to lead his soldiers out from their cover to meet this iron steamroller. Close quarters combat begins. The Spartans fight to the death. They snap the sarissas with their bare hands, trying to hack their way through to the Macedonian shields. Doson gives the order to reform the phalanx into a doubled, incredibly dense formation. The sheer pressure of this mass physically squeezes the Spartans off the summit. Of the 6,000 full Spartiates who began this battle, barely 200 will remain standing. The rest choose death over retreat. Cleomenes, along with a handful of horsemen, abandons his army and flees to the coast to sail into Egyptian exile. When, after the battle, Antigonus Doson summons the cavalry commander and asks why he broke orders and attacked before the signal, the officer makes excuses. It was all that crazy youth from Megalopolis. The king replies, "That youth acted like a great general at the decisive moment, while you, general, behaved like a worthless youth." The victor descends into the Eurotas Valley. Antigonus Doson achieves what neither Persian overlords, Theban hegemons, nor Alexander the Great himself had managed. His army marches unopposed into the streets of Sparta. For centuries, this city had boasted that its only walls were the shields of its citizens. Now those shields are broken, and the city is defenseless. The Macedonian veterans await the order to sack the wealthiest polis in the Peloponnese. But Doson stops them. He does not burn the temples or enslave the inhabitants. He declares that his enemy was the tyrant Cleomenes, not the people of Sparta. The king restores the city's ancient laws and offers sacrifices to the local gods. The Hellenes, who had hated Macedonian occupiers for centuries, are stunned by this act. Doson cements his power, not on fear, but on respect, becoming the hegemon of Greece. It seemed Macedonia had finally found the peace it had awaited for decades. But no sooner does Antigonus accept the honors at the Nemean Games than word arrives. Illyrian tribes have broken through the borders in the north. The ruler of Greece is forced to abandon the festivities and hastily march his regiments back to meet the new threat. Doson went north to win his final victory. He did not yet know that the price of this triumph would be his own life, and that the throne would pass to a 17-year-old boy who would eventually destroy everything that had just been saved. Summer of 222 BC. The Peloponnese is rejoicing. The Nemean Games are taking place in Argos, and the absolute hero of the festival is Antigonus Doson. The Hellenes, who had hated Macedonian monarchs for centuries, grant him the highest honors. He was the first in history to take Sparta, yet he didn't level it to the ground, instead restoring the police ancient laws. It seemed the king had reached the absolute zenith of glory. But the celebrations are interrupted. A messenger pushes his way straight to the ruler's tent. The northern borders are breached. Illyrian tribes have poured into Macedonia, burning villages and wiping out garrisons. Antigonus is terminally ill. Plutarch writes that the monarch was being devoured by consumption. He was coughing up blood, suffocating in his tent, and could barely stay in the saddle. Any other sovereign would have sent mercenaries or experienced generals up north. But Doson had subordinated his every move to a single goal: to hand the throne over safely to his 17-year-old nephew Philip. Gasping for air, the ruler raises the army and undertakes an exhausting forced march back to the north to face the barbarians. The two armies clash on the plains of Macedonia. The Illyrians are not disciplined Spartans. They press forward in a disorganized mass. The battle quickly devolves into a brutal slaughter. At the decisive moment, the Macedonian lines begin to waver. Doson realizes, if the phalanx breaks here, everything he has built over long years will collapse in a single day. He takes a deep breath, fighting through the agony in his disease-eaten lungs. The king rises in his stirrups and lets out a deafening roar, rallying his troops and giving the order for the final counterattack. Seeing the enemy break formation and turn into a panicked rout, Antigonus triumphantly shouts, "O glorious day!" And in that very instant, his body fails. The victor's shout proves fatal. The sheer strain bursts a blood vessel inside the king. Blood gushes from his mouth. The master of Greece falls from his horse, gripped by fever. He will die a few days later, never recovering from this blow. Antigonus Doson did not fall to an enemy blade. He was killed by his own triumph. Doson, he who promises, kept his word. Dying on the battlefield after a victory, he left young Philip V far more than just a country. He handed him a stable state with pacified neighbors, a fiercely loyal army, a full treasury, and unquestioned hegemony in the Balkans. Antigonus passed into eternity as one of the most noble rulers of antiquity. However, it was precisely his inheritance that would soon turn into a catastrophe. The death of his guardian removed every restraining barrier. 17-year-old Philip was left completely alone with absolute power. The young man, who had never known the bitterness of defeat and had not built this empire with his own hands, was handed the keys to the supreme military machine of the known world, and soon this teenager would begin to use it in a way that would forever strip his dynasty of a future. 221 BC. The throne room in Pella sits empty, while anxious whispers spread throughout the Greek polis. The death of Antigonus Doson had left the empire at the absolute peak of its power, but had passed control of the state to a 17-year-old teenager. In the Hellenistic world, a transition of power is always an open invitation to rebellion. The seasoned rulers of Syria and Egypt spent years proving their right to the crown by slaughtering their own relatives. The young Philip was expected to show weakness. The Spartans and Aetolians were already preparing for war, anticipating that the Macedonian juggernaut would crumble under a boy's command. But Philip held the country together. Moreover, in just a few short months, he charmed the ancient world. The historian Polybius, who decades later would curse this monarch, called him a word quite unusual for a ruler: eromenos, the darling of the Hellenes. Diplomats described the youth as a man with a phenomenal memory and a truly regal bearing. However, the favor of Macedonian veterans cannot be bought with a charming smile at court receptions. The respect of the phalanx had to be won where blood was spilled. The forests in the foothills of Mount Olympus. A group of young aristocrats pushes through the dense undergrowth. They wear no armor, just traditional Macedonian dress, the broad kazia hat, and the light chlamys cloak. This is no mere entertainment for bored nobles. In Macedonia, the royal hunt served simultaneously as a political election and a coming-of-age exam. They are tracking a massive boar. According to the rules of the cult of Heracles the hunter, the young monarch is required to be the first to engage the beast in close combat. No safe distances, only a spear and reflexes. A veteran general watches silently from the sidelines. 17-year-old Philip steps forward. A lunge, a strike, and the blade pierces flesh. Blood splatters the dry earth. The Ephebi youths and old guardsmen approvingly beat the shafts of their spears against their shields. The test is passed. Why would the ruler of a massive empire personally risk his life in the woods? For a Macedonian soldier, politics and physical valor are inseparable. The cult of Heracles the hunter served as a bridge to their legendary ancestors Alexander the Great and Philip II. By issuing strict decrees on the proper wearing of uniforms for his hunting companions, Philip V was creating not just a retinue, but a fiercely loyal brotherhood forged in danger. He was building the image of the first among equals, a leader ready to sleep on the damp earth. The free polis looked at the young man and sighed with relief. Politicians believed they had found the perfect hegemon, respectful of traditions, tough, yet entirely devoid of the paranoia of the old dictators. They expected to see in him an accommodating defender. But by encouraging his games of playing Heracles, the Hellenes overlooked one thing: a young man who had tasted blood in the forests of Olympus would very soon want to apply his skills on the battlefield. Philip V secured the loyalty of the army and the adoration of his allies. It seemed like a solid foundation for a long peace. But peacetime is a brutal test for someone who has just felt his own strength. Their neighbors, the Aetolians, masters of pillage and provocation, decided to test the limits. They struck at Macedonia's Greek allies, assuming the inexperienced king would get bogged down in endless negotiations and be too afraid to march his troops out of their barracks with winter approaching. They expected a bewildered diplomat. But marching out to meet them was the Macedonian army, led by the young monarch himself. In the ancient world, there was an unwritten rule. War was a seasonal occupation. With the onset of the cold, armies returned to their barracks, ships are dragged ashore, and soldiers repair their gear. The Aetolians, masters of plunder and lightning raids, lived exactly by this clock. Having ravaged the lands of the Peloponnese, they retreated for the winter, confident that the 17-year-old Macedonian king would never risk marching his troops through the snow. They waited for spring to resume their raids. But during the winter solstice, when mountain passes are choked with snow, Philip V executes a forced march unprecedented in ancient logistics. His troops suddenly appear in the very heart of the Peloponnese, at the walls of Corinth. The sheer speed of his advance deprives the enemy of any time to prepare. Not giving the Aetolians a moment to recover, Philip crashes down on the mountain fortress of Sophis and takes it by storm, turning it into a new Macedonian bastion to protect his allies. The boy from yesterday is acting with cold calculation, shattering the enemy's strategy with a single unpredictable move. But the main test for the Macedonian army lay ahead. Philip understood. Chasing Aetolian raiders across land meant exhausting his forces. To win the social war, he needed to cut the enemy's maritime supply lines and strike their island bases. For this, he needed a fleet, which Macedonia practically didn't have. The king gathers allied ships in the port of Lycaeum, but faces a severe shortage of trained rowers. And then, Philip issues an order that breaks centuries-old military traditions. The heavily armed elite, the very phalangites whose profession was to hold 20-foot sarissas and tear through enemy lines, are ordered to man the oars. For an ancient heavy infantryman, rowing was always considered the work of the poor, slaves, and mercenaries, a task entirely beneath the dignity of a Macedonian conqueror. But Philip forces them to train, subordinating their class pride to his tactical objective. Encased in bronze, the infantrymen take up the oars and ferry the army across the Gulf to the shores of Cephallenia, laying a surprise siege to the crucial Aetolian stronghold, the city of Pella. In a single year, Philip crushed every hope his neighbors had of his weakness. He proved faster and harsher than anyone could have imagined. The Greek polis, who had hated Macedonia for centuries, looked at the young man with sheer admiration. To them, he became a savior, a shield against pillagers. It was this absolute decisiveness that soon earned him the title Eromenos, the darling of the Hellenes. Politicians in allied cities breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the young king would be their reliable and obedient sword. But while the Hellenes applauded the new hero, deep resentment was brewing in the shadows of the royal tent. The old Macedonian generals, the guardians left behind by the late Antigonus Doson, watched their pupil's ascent without joy. They had expected to control an easy-to-manage puppet. Instead, they saw an alpha leader who was unilaterally waging war and forcing their elite troops to sit at the oars. The young man had taken far too much power for himself, and the old guard decided it was time to remind him who actually ruled the empire. Philip's victories in the Peloponnese sparked euphoria among the Greeks, but in the Macedonian camp they bred a sullen resentment. Upon his death, Antigonus Doson had left his nephew not only a prospering state, but also a circle of highly influential guardians. Apelles, Megalius, and Leontius, who commanded the elite peltast units, were accustomed to holding the levers of power in their own hands. To these veterans, the young king was nothing more than a convenient smokescreen. They intended to rule in his name, dictating their will to all of Greece. But their pupil was spinning out of control. Philip was increasingly listening not to the Macedonians, but to the leader of the Achaean League, Aratus of Sicyon. The old guard despised diplomacy. To the generals, the Greeks were merely a resource to be subjugated by force, not allies to be engaged in lengthy negotiations. Realizing their influence was slipping away, the Guardians launch a campaign of sabotage to prove to the boy just how helpless he is. Apelles issues secret orders. Macedonian soldiers are permitted to kick Achaeans out of their tents in billets and steal their share of the loot. In the political arena, the Guardian meddles in the elections of the Achaean League, pushing opponents of Aratus into power. When these intrigues fail, the conspirators turn to outright treason on the battlefield. In the winter of 218 BC, during the assault on the city of Pella on the island of Cephallenia, Leontius deliberately holds back his elite units. A breached defensive line remains untaken. The Macedonians suffer a defeat due to artificially created chaos, all while their commanders watch the failure unfold. The Guardians were teaching the monarch a lesson. Without their will, he cannot win a single battle. To completely break the king's spirit, the conspirators incite an open mutiny within the very core of Macedonian power, the peltasts. The armed veterans refuse orders. The mentors wait for the terrified teenager, confronted by a mob of his own soldiers, to come running to them for salvation and voluntarily hand over real power. But Philip does not panic. The young man, who was used to charging headfirst at wild boars in the forests of Olympus, had no intention of hiding behind the backs of traitors. Instead of begging for help, he acts with freezing calculation. The king isolates the leaders of the conspiracy from one another and leverages his personal authority among the rank-and-file soldiers, personally walking among the campfires to win back the army's loyalty. When Apelles, fully confident in his impunity, arrives at the royal tent expecting honors and pleas for intercession, the guards simply block his path. The heavy flap of the tent closes right in his face. The trial of his former mentors was lightning fast. Leontius and Megalius are arrested. Some are executed. Others are forced to commit suicide. The blood of the men who were supposed to be the shield of the dynasty soaks into the dirt of the Macedonian camp. The execution of the old guard was a point of no return for Philip. Antigonus Doson had left these men to protect the ruler, but they taught him a dark lesson in power, forcing him to kill his own for the very first time. Having rid himself of the ghosts of the past, the monarch realized he no longer needed mentors. He had tasted absolute control over the ultimate military machine of the Balkans. While Philip was cleaning house in his tent, Aetolian raiding parties in the north sacked and burned the sacred Macedonian city of Dium. The sovereign, intoxicated by his newly consolidated power, decides that a standard military response will not be enough. He is ready to show Greece the face not just of a defender, but of an avenger. While Philip asserted control over the army, disaster struck the north. The Aetolians, realizing the young king was bogged down in the political intrigues of the Peloponnese, invaded Macedonia and put the torch to Diomede Kingdom's sacred city, the abode of the Olympian gods and the heart of Macedonian identity. Temples were shattered, sanctuaries desecrated. To the ancient world, this wasn't just military damage. It was a public slap in the face. The Aetolians were certain the youth would get tied up in endless talks and searches for allies. They expected diplomatic protests, but the Macedonian army was already marching to meet them. In 218 BC, Philip executes a forced march that stuns all of Greece. He leads his troops through mountain passes straight into the heart of Aetolian to their sacred capital, the city of Thermum. For centuries, the Aetolians believed Thermum was impregnable. It hid among the crags like an eagle's nest, serving as their national treasury and the site of the League's most holy gatherings. A hostile army had never before set foot on these stones. But early one morning, Macedonian vanguards appear on the heights surrounding the city. Systematic looting begins. Macedonian phalangites pour into the streets of the sacred polis. Philip orders everything to be dragged out of the temple galleries, the accumulated wealth of generations of Aetolians. Soldiers tear 15,000 gold and silver shields from the walls, offerings to the gods from the victors of bygone eras. 15,000 shields is an arsenal large enough to equip a whole army. The Macedonians load this mountain of metal onto wagons, and whatever they cannot carry, they burn on the spot. But Philip does not stop at plunder. Intoxicated by vengeance, he issues an order that will strip him of his status as a noble ruler. Macedonian veterans pick up sledgehammers and begin smashing the sacred statues. The marble faces of deities that had stood there for centuries are shattered into dust beneath the hammer's blows. Ancient porticos are set ablaze. Columns crash down with a deafening roar. Philip believed he was dispensing righteous retribution, answering for the desecration of Dium. To him it was an act of justice, where he acted as the punishing right hand of Olympus. But the historian Polybius, writing about that day, passes a severe judgment on the young king. According to the unwritten laws of the Hellenistic world, even in the most brutal wars, holy sites remained untouchable. By destroying the temples of Thermum, Philip was not destroying Aetolia. He was burning away his own image. In trying to punish barbarians for sacrilege, the king himself became a barbarian who had violated ancient taboos. That evening, as Thermum burned down to embers and thick black smoke blotted out the sky, a group of the king's closest friends strolled through the ruins. One of them walked up to a charred temple wall, picked up a piece of glowing coal from the ground and scrawled a line on the stone that would instantly echo throughout Greece. "Seest thou the shaft divine, how far it flies?" They laughed, looking at the ash, believing that this fire would permanently cement their dominance over the Balkans. But the triumph proved short-lived. Hauling away his wagons of loot, Philip thought he had broken the spirit of his enemies. In reality, the Aetolians weren't the only ones who saw that smoke. Soon, a man without a country would arrive at the Macedonian court, and his quiet whispers would force Philip to turn his gaze beyond Greece. The king would loose this arrow of Zeus toward the west, straight at the Roman legions. The ashes of burned Thermum were still cooling when a man appeared at the Macedonian court who would force the king to look far beyond the borders of Greece. His name was Demetrius of Pharos. He didn't wear a traditional Macedonian cloak and knew nothing of the subtleties of Hellenistic philosophy. He had ruled the Adriatic like a pirate baron until Roman legions drove him from his home islands, stripping him of his state. To Philip's Greek advisors, the center of the universe remained Athens, Sparta, and Pella. To Demetrius, real history was being forged far outside the Balkans. He became the shadow behind the monarch's back, constantly whispering about the West. Philip considered himself an invincible conqueror, but the Illyrian refugee unrolled a map of the world before him, where Macedonia looked like nothing more than a provincial player. Summer 217 BC. Philip V is attending the Nemean Games when a messenger pushes through with news. Far away in Italy, the Carthaginian general Hannibal has just annihilated the Roman legions at Lake Trasimene. The state that had exiled Demetrius of Pharos was now on the brink of total collapse. The king shows the message to his new favorite. The Illyrian instantly assesses the situation and urges Philip to abandon petty Greek squabbles and strike at the weakened Rome. To enter the great game, the monarch needed quiet at home. He hastily convenes a peace conference at Naupactus to end the social war. It is there that the Aetolian politician Agelaus delivers a prophetic speech. He points toward the horizon and begs the Greeks to end their fratricide, drawing their attention to the clouds gathering in the west. Agelaus warns, whoever wins the clash between Rome and Carthage, that victor will sooner or later turn his gaze toward Hellas. But Philip heard something entirely different in those words. The young monarch, intoxicated by his early victories and the whisperings of the Pharos exile, took the phrase about western clouds not as a threat, but as an invitation. He saw himself as a new Alexander, ferrying his phalanxes across the Adriatic Sea to share dominion of the world with Hannibal. For 2 years, the Macedonian ruler plays a secret diplomatic game. In 215 BC, he officially concludes a military pact with Carthage. The treaty entails a division of spheres of influence. Hannibal gets Italy, while Philip secures control over the Balkans and the return of Roman possessions in Illyria. The king considered this pact the absolute pinnacle of geopolitical calculation. But instead of an alliance of conquerors, he got a war. The ship carrying the Macedonian envoys and the text of the treaty is intercepted by Roman patrols. The scroll is laid on the desk of the Senate. Philip thought he was going to divide the spoils, but in reality, he had only painted a target on his own back for Rome. By challenging the Republic, the Macedonian sovereign forever altered his fate. To transport troops to Italy and launch the campaign, he needed an absolutely secure rear. A freedom-loving, endlessly arguing Greece no longer suited the monarch. And for the sake of enforcing this obedience, the beloved of the Hellenes would decide to finally rip off the mask of the noble savior. He will travel to the allied city of Messene, where he will utter a phrase that will strip him of his moral authority and drown Hellas in blood. By concluding a secret pact with Hannibal, Philip V staked his claim to supreme hegemony. But to wage war in the west against Rome, he needed a secure and absolute rear in the east. A freedom-loving, constantly debating Greece with its democratic assemblies no longer fit his imperial blueprints. The monarch didn't need allies, he needed subjects. And in 215 BC, this demand for control led him to the city of Messene in the Peloponnese. A classic social conflict was raging in Messene. The wealthy aristocracy was locked in a power struggle against the common people. Just a couple of years earlier, the darling of the Hellenes would have acted as an arbiter, reconciling the factions and restoring the law. But Philip decides to act differently. He secretly fuels the hatred between the factions, promising his support to both sides. The results exceeded his expectations. The provoked mob slaughters about 200 of the city's magistrates. 200 high-ranking officials are torn to pieces in a single day. It would be the modern equivalent of an independent state having its entire parliament physically wiped out overnight. The city is paralyzed by terror. The next day, Philip climbs to the Acropolis of Messene, the sheer mountain of Ithome, towering over the blood-soaked valley. There, at an ancient altar, a traditional sacrifice is offered to the gods. The young king stands before the stone altar. In his hands are the still warm, blood-slicked entrails of the slaughtered animal. Frozen on either side of the monarch are two men embodying the two paths for Macedonia. On the left is his old mentor, Aratus of Sicyon, the voice of tradition and diplomacy. On the right is the exiled Demetrius of Pharos, the voice of brute force. Philip holds out the bloody entrails to his advisors and asks, "What do the gods say? Must he withdraw his troops from Messene, as the law demands, or leave his garrison here, seizing the citadel forever?" Aratus answers firmly, "If you leave soldiers here, you will betray the trust of all Greeks. Your best fortress is their love." But then Demetrius steps forward. He looks at Mount Ithome, then points into the distance toward Acrocorinth, and utters a phrase that will define the new policy of Macedonia. "If you have a bull, hold it by both horns." The two horns of the Peloponnese, Ithome and Acrocorinth. By seizing both citadels, the king will bring all of Greece under his iron grip. Philip takes a deep breath. He throws the entrails back onto the altar, turns his back on his old teacher, and chooses the path of force. The young monarch believed that by applying fear, he was ensuring his own security ahead of the coming war with Rome. He thought that by taking the bull by the horns, He would subjugate Hellas and eliminate the threat of uprisings. But by seizing the fortress, he lost his moral authority entirely. The Hellenes realized that their savior was just another despot. In trying to bind Greece with fear to win against the Romans, Philip single-handedly pushed the Greek polis right into the arms of the Republic. Descending from Mount Ithome, Philip was a different man. The youth who had galloped through a blizzard to save his allies was left in the past. But one obstacle remained in the path of his new policy. Aratus of Sicyon could no longer hide his contempt for the king. He silently condemned the king's every action, and this silence burned Philip's ego worse than any public insult. The monarch could not tolerate a living reproach to his conscience, and soon the ruler of Macedonia would decide that an old affection could be easily erased by adding a few drops of the right poison to a cup of wine. The decision was made. Descending from Mount Ithome, Philip left behind more than just a Messene awash in the blood of its magistrates. He said goodbye to his former self. The king chose terror as his primary instrument of governance. But this kind of power always comes with one fatal flaw. It cannot bear looking in a mirror. For Philip, that mirror was Aratus of Sicyon, the head of the Achaean League, the very man who had once handed the fortress of Acrocorinth to Philip's adoptive father, Doson. The old man who had guided Philip's own first steps, acting in many ways as his surrogate father. Following the massacre in Messenia, Aratus stops giving the king advice. He steps back into the shadows and remains silent. And this silence sears Philip's pride worse than any open armed rebellion. For a dictator, there is nothing more terrifying than a living, breathing rebuke. Aratus had known him as someone else, the darling of the Hellenes, riding through a snowstorm to aid his allies. Now every glance from the old man, every dry diplomatic dispatch, reminded the monarch of the monster he had become. In 213 BC, Philip decides to erase this reminder. A public execution or a trial of the head of the Achaean League is impossible. It would trigger an uprising across the entire Peloponnese. Philip opts for quiet elimination. But this is not a poison that kills in a matter of moments. Ancient historians, Polybius and Plutarch, preserve the account. On the king's orders, the Macedonian officer Torion slips Aratus a slow-acting toxin. Day after day, the substance burns his lungs, mimicking a severe wasting disease. Aratus returns to his native Sicyon and begins to fade. He is tormented by fever and racked by coughs. And here, the incredible composure of the old politician is revealed. Aratus understands everything. He knows exactly who is killing him, but he continues to stay silent. He doesn't launch a rebellion. He doesn't write manifestos to the polis, knowing it would plunge his league into a suicidal war with the Macedonian phalanx. He dies just as pragmatically as he lived, but right before the very end, he utters a single phrase. His friend Cephalon comes to visit the bedridden politician. He sees the old man struggling for air, and on the wall next to the bed, he spots fresh splatters of blood coughed up from his lungs. Cephalon asks how he is feeling. Aratus looks at his friend for a long time. He points a trembling hand at the blood-stained wall. "This, Cephalon," he says quietly, "this is the reward of a king's friendship." Those words perfectly captured the total collapse of Macedonian diplomacy in Greece. Philip believed he was merely removing a political obstacle. Aratus had become too independent, too attached to his archaic ideals of freedom. The king believed, by removing his mentor, he would free his hands for the grand game against Rome. He was getting rid of a man who prevented him from ruling unilaterally and ruthlessly. Soon, Aratus of Sicyon dies. The Achaean League grants him the highest state funeral, honoring him as a founding hero. Philip thought he had scored an elegant victory. In reality, his poisoning resulted in a devastating political defeat. Rumors of the poison, despite all precautions, spread like wildfire across the Greek polis. The trust that Antigonus Doson had spent years building, the very foundation of Macedonian hegemony, collapsed. The Hellenes understood the darling was dead. Sitting on the throne in Pella was a man capable of cold-bloodedly poisoning the very people who had brought him to power. Philip killed Aratus to confidently face the threat from the west, but by doing so, he shattered the only shield that could have saved him, the loyalty of the Greeks. Now, when Roman sails appeared on the horizon, many in Hellas would not view them as foreign invaders. They would view them as liberators, coming to save them from the Macedonian king. And Rome would not miss this chance. The First Macedonian War ended in a draw. Having signed the peace, Philip believed he had secured his western flank, and he turned his gaze east. In Egypt, Ptolemy IV had died, leaving the throne to a 5-year-old child. The Ptolemaic state, rocked by internal rebellions, looked like easy prey. Two monarchs, Philip and Antiochus III, forge a secret pact, agreeing to carve up the child ruler's empire and divide his territories in the Aegean Sea. Naval expansion requires colossal funding. To finance his ambitions, Philip turns to outright piracy. He appoints Dicaearchus as commander of the Macedonian fleet, tasking him with attacking the Cyclades. Macedonian ships begin severing trade routes and extorting tribute from merchant vessels. To the ancient world, it looked as if the guarantor of regional security had suddenly become the head of a pirate cartel. In 202 BC, the Macedonians capture the Greek city of Cius on the shores of the Sea of Marmara, acting on behalf of Philip's relative, the Bithynian king Prusias I. Upon taking the city, the monarch shows no traditional mercy. He enslaves the entire population of Cius, selling the citizens to fill his treasury. The historian Polybius emphasizes this point. Philip believed his actions were entirely justified, thinking that such brutality would strike terror into anyone who dared oppose him. But the effect of the destruction of Cius was exactly the opposite. When a messenger arrived at the Prytanean government building on the island of Rhodes and publicly announced the enslavement of the citizens, local politicians were horrified. The Rhodians, who boasted the strongest fleet and had spent centuries defending the freedom of maritime trade, from that day forward considered Philip their greatest enemy. They were soon joined by the Aetolians, who had lost their own cities and realized that treaties with Macedonia were now completely worthless. By destroying Chios and sponsoring piracy, the king believed he was projecting strength, but in reality, he had only stripped himself of his final allies. The Hellenes discarded their illusions. The former darling had turned into a despot, selling Greeks into slavery for gold. Rhodes and the kingdom of Pergamum declare open war on Macedonia. However, the rulers of these states understand perfectly well. Alone, they cannot hold back the Macedonian phalanx, and so they look for help from an outside power. Their envoys depart for the west. The Roman Republic had just finished the exhausting Second Punic War. Carthage was defeated. Now the Senate listens carefully to the stories of Greek diplomats about a king who sacks cities and threatens the stability of the entire Mediterranean. Rome makes the decision to intervene. Battle-hardened legions prepare to set sail for the Balkans. They will be led by a man who will turn the slogan of the freedom of the Hellenes into the ultimate tool of Roman expansion. The sacking of Greek cities, state-sponsored piracy, and political assassinations had finally overflowed the cup of patience, and help came not from Sparta or Athens, but from the west. The Roman Republic had just finished its war with Carthage. Having dealt with Hannibal, the Senate turned its attention to the Balkans. The Second Macedonian War begins. At the head of the Roman legions stands Titus Quinctius Flamininus. The 30-year-old consul was not a typical Roman soldier. He spoke brilliant Greek, knew ancient philosophy, and brought with him a devastating political weapon, the slogan, "Freedom for Greece." Philip's former allies, exhausted by his brutal policies, tear up their treaties one by one. The Achaean League defects to Rome's side. The Macedonian king is left completely isolated. The policy of intimidation he had chosen back in Messenia has left him entirely alone against the Roman legions. 197 BC. Thessaly. A ridge of steep, jagged hills known as Cynocephalae, dogs' heads. Early morning. A light drizzling rain and a thick fog blanket the ground. Visibility is practically zero. The two massive armies stumble blindly through the mist, sending out scouts until their vanguards crash nose to nose. A chaotic, fragmented battle breaks out on the slippery slopes. Philip takes command of the right flank. The fog begins to lift slightly, and the king sees his chance. He gives the order to attack. The Macedonian phalanx locks its shields, lowers a forest of 20-foot sarissas, and rolls down the slope like a solid wall. The Roman legionaries cannot hack through this thicket of pikes and are forced backward, leaving hundreds of dead in the grass. Philip is triumphant. This right flank is steadily crushing the enemy. It seems victory is already in his grasp. But he cannot see what is happening on his left. The phalanx is a highly complex mechanism. To function, it needs perfectly flat ground. On the broken hills of Cynocephalae, the Macedonian left flank breaks formation as it tries to deploy from a marching column into a battle line. Soldiers stumble, lines tear open, creating massive gaps. Flamininus throws war elephants and legionaries into the breaches, easily tossing back the disorganized units. The Roman right flank wins just as decisively as the Macedonian right. At this exact moment, the outcome of the battle is decided by the initiative of a single officer whose name history did not record. an unknown Roman tribune, sees that Philip's right flank has gotten too carried away with its advance. The phalanx has pushed far forward, cutting itself off from its reserves, completely exposing its rear. The tribune does not wait for orders from the consul. He unilaterally detaches 20 maniples, about 2,000 legionaries, from the victorious right wing, and executes a rapid flanking maneuver. The Romans crash into the backs of the advancing Macedonians. Total chaos erupts inside the formation. A phalangite, gripping a heavy sarissa with both hands, physically cannot turn around quickly. His formation is lumbering and bristles with weapons in only one direction. When Roman soldiers with their short gladii burst in from behind, the formation disintegrates instantly. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, the Macedonians raise their spears vertically, the traditional Hellenistic sign of surrender. But the Romans either don't know the gesture or simply have no intention of leaving their enemies alive. 8,000 of Philip's soldiers are left dead on the slopes. This defeat was something much larger than just a lost battle. On the hills of Cynocephali, the myth of the invincible Macedonian phalanx, which had dominated military minds since the days of Alexander the Great, was shattered. The clash of two tactical systems vividly proved a rigid wall of spears is doomed in the face of the flexible, adaptable, manipular legion. Philip, avoiding capture, flees with the remnants of his troops. Yesterday's darling of the Hellenes is forced to sign a crushing peace treaty. Macedonia gives up all its possessions in Greece, surrenders its fleet, pays an indemnity of 1,000 talents, and sends the king's younger son, Demetrius, to Rome as a hostage. The king was backed into a corner, stripped of allies and locked within the borders of his own country. He could have resigned himself to the role of an obedient vassal. But Philip began to systematically prepare for revenge. He decided to restructure the very economy of his state for the sake of future war. But the consequences of these reforms would be even more destructive for Macedonia. The defeat at Cynocephali left Philip V in total isolation. The Romans had stripped him of his fleet, pushed him out of Greece, and forced him to pay 1,000 talent indemnity. Many Hellenistic rulers in his position would have settled for the role of a vassal, but the monarch refused to surrender. In the silence of his palace in Pella, the king began methodically preparing for revenge. He understood. To once again challenge the human resources of the Roman Republic, his state had to be transformed into a massive military camp. Philip launches a massive economic mobilization. The king reopens long-abandoned gold and silver mines. He hikes up port tariffs and taxes on agricultural produce. To stimulate local trade and relieve the pressure on the central treasury, the monarch allows Macedonian cities and districts to mint their own local bronze coins. This pragmatic calculation works. The treasury fills up. Ingots pile up in the vaults, weapons in the arsenals, and the granaries are packed with grain. In a very short time, Philip rebuilds the economy, squeezing the absolute maximum out of the country. But this growth came at a heavy cost. Money cannot hold spears. Philip lacked men for the phalanx, and so the ruler makes a decision that fractures the social foundation of his state. he embarks on mass deportations of entire peoples. Philip orders Thracian tribes to be moved from the northern borders deep inland into Macedonian cities, and he forcibly uproots thousands of native Macedonians, sending them to the peripheries to serve as border guards. The king had two goals: to bolster his army with fierce Thracian warriors, and to dilute the Macedonian polis, where discontent might be brewing. Families that had lived on their lands for centuries were forced to abandon their homes and march under the guard of royal troops. The social fabric of Macedonia was ripped apart. Philip was rebuilding the economy to save his people from Roman subjugation, but in the process, he completely lost the loyalty of his subjects. The Macedonians, who had once idolized him as the darling of the Hellenes, now openly hated their king. Whispers of this hatred reach Philip. Surrounded by enemies, the aging monarch becomes deeply paranoid. He begins seeing conspiracies everywhere. Philip unleashes a reign of terror against the Macedonian aristocracy, sending dozens of noble citizens to their execution. Ancient chronicles record a brutal practice. When ordering the execution of a nobleman, the king commanded that all of the man's sons be killed as well. He wiped out entire generations to ensure no future avengers would survive. These savage repressions guaranteed his immediate safety. The treasury was full. The army was rebuilt. It seemed his revenge was just around the corner. But Philip failed to realize that the greatest threat lay not in the Roman legions, nor in the disgruntled nobility. The true threat came from his very own family. His two sons. One hated Rome, while the other was the political favorite of the Senate. While the father slaughtered other men's children out of fear for the future, his own heirs were preparing to spill family blood. Having restored the economy and the army, Philip V turned Macedonia into an armed fortress. However, walls are useless if the front line runs straight through the monarch's own family. While the king prepared for the future war with the Romans, a bitter clash was brewing in the palace in Pella between his two sons. This wasn't merely a conflict over succession, it was a schism over the political trajectory of the country. The elder son, Perseus, embodied the old Garda, fiercely anti-Roman heir who saw the Republic as an existential threat. The younger son, Demetrius, represented an entirely different world. After his father's defeat at Cynocephaly, the young man had spent years in Rome as a political hostage. He grew up among the very people who had humiliated his homeland, but returned an admirer of Western culture. Demetrius had built connections in the Senate and grown close to Titus Flamininus, the architect of Macedonia's defeat. Roman politicians ruthlessly exploited this affection. The Senate began to openly favor the younger son, granting him more honors than the ambassadors of the aging king. Rome was sending a clear message: we are waiting for this young man to replace his father on the throne. To Philip, who had spent decades meticulously building his independence, this was a public humiliation. Demetrius believed his friendship with Flamininus was a diplomatic shield for Macedonia. In reality, this alliance became his death sentence. The Romans didn't need to send legions to destroy the ruling house. They only needed to show favor to the younger son to make the elder pay pick up a knife. Perseus struck at his father's vulnerabilities. He didn't cause public scandals. He worked through whispers and hints. Why does my brother write to Rome so often? What is he whispering about with diplomats behind the king's back? These suspicions began to eat away at the monarch's mind. But Philip refused to execute his son based purely on rumors. He needed concrete proof. The king secretly dispatches two officers, Apelles and Philoclesto, Rome with a mission. Find out if Demetrius is truly playing a double game and planning to use Roman backing to seize the throne. In the autumn of 181 BC, the envoys returned to Pella. They lay a sealed parchment before the king. It is a letter bearing the personal seal of Titus Flamininus. The text inside strips Philip of his last illusions. The Roman commander asks the monarch to forgive Demetrius for his ambitions and his desire to take the throne, assuring the king that the young man was not plotting anything irreversible against his family. Livy calls this letter a forgery, fabricated by Perseus. Philocles and Apelles had likely been bribed by the elder brother to bring back exactly the evidence the monarch dreaded to see. But the authenticity of the document doesn't matter. What matters is how the text detonated inside the king's mind. The letter confirmed Philip's deepest fears. The king, who had spent years executing the children of his opponents for the sake of security, now suspected treason in his own family. He was forced to choose. Leaving Demetrius alive meant a civil war where Roman legions would stand behind the younger son. Killing him meant destroying the darling of the people. Philip decides to eliminate the threat. But publicly executing a pro-Roman prince would trigger a riot in the capital and an invasion from the west. To preserve the state, the heir's death had to look like an accident. The strike had to happen quietly on the road to the provinces. 181 BC. Macedonia stood frozen in anticipation of an inevitable war, pulling troops to the borders and counting its reserves of gold. But Philip V lost his most important battle inside his own palace. Having read the letter forged by Perseus, sealed with the fake emblem of the Roman general Flamininus, the king crosses the Rubicon. The dictator, who had spent years wiping out the opposition to maintain power, turns his gaze upon his own family. He passes a death sentence on Demetrius' youngest son, the favorite of the people, and the diplomatic hope of the nation. Philip does not convene a public trial. An open process would have sparked a mutiny within the phalanx and handed Rome the perfect pretext for a direct invasion. The monarch opts for a quiet, backroom assassination. The order to eliminate the prince is given in whispers, as if dealing with a treasonous state criminal rather than the heir to the Macedonian throne. A distant provincial city where Demetrius had been sent under the guise of a routine inspection. The dead of night, a trusted officer of the king enters the prince's chambers. He doesn't draw his sword, striving to maintain the illusion of a natural death. The young man, who had grown up among senators and believed in the power of treaties, is handed a cup of poison. The toxin works agonizingly slowly. Ancient chroniclers record a horrific detail. To muffle the dying screams of the convulsing prince, the assassins had to throw themselves on him and smother him. Demetrius dies in the dark, betrayed by his own brother and condemned to death by his father. Philip believed he was acting as a pragmatic surgeon. He was convinced that by amputating a limb infected with Roman influence, he would save the entire body of Macedonia. The king thought the murder would prevent a civil war and unite the nation behind the anti-Roman course of his elder son. He sacrificed his child for state security, viewing it as the ultimate exercise of sovereign will. But the secret assassination filled the palace with mourning and the country with a heavy, unspoken resentment. The house of Antigonus had remained a unique phenomenon in the Hellenistic world for centuries. Here, sons did not kill fathers, and brothers did not butcher brothers for the sake of power. Philip V became the only ruler in the history of his dynasty to raise his hand against his own child. In trying to defend the state's independence from Rome, he burned the moral foundation of his throne to ash. The image of the darling of the Hellenes was finally erased, leaving behind only a tyrant who had murdered his own heir. His brother's death was a spectacular political victory for Perseus. The elder heir rejoiced, confident that his scheme had worked flawlessly. His rival was dead, and his path to the crown was clear. He thought he had closed this chapter forever. But a lie has one fatal flaw. It leaves witnesses. The prince lay in the earth, yet his ghost robbed the king of sleep. The aging Philip, tormented by doubt, began asking the questions he had been too terrified to voice before. And soon, royal investigators would reach the very men who had forged that fatal letter. The truth would break out, and this discovery would deliver a blow to the old monarch far more terrible than any Roman sword. The execution was carried out quietly, but it struck Macedonia like an earthquake. Demetrius, the hope of the people and the guarantor of a possible peace with Rome, was dead. For the first few months following the execution, Philip V convinced himself that he had saved the state. He believed he had burned out the Roman threat and prevented a civil war. Now, the nation was supposed to rally around its sole remaining heir, Perseus. But having secured the status of successor, the elder son stops playing the role of the obedient servant. Ancient authors record a sharp shift. Perseus starts behaving not like an heir, but like a ruler. He ignores his father, builds his own retinue, and accepts honors meant strictly for the monarch. Philip, who had spent years intensely sensitive to the slightest shifts in power, realizes that he eliminated one problem only to grow an usurper behind his own back. The paranoia that had doomed the younger son now turned upon the elder. Philip starts asking questions. The king summons servants for interrogation and launches a secret investigation. The torturers get to work. Witnesses and informants, who only recently were taking gold from Perseus's hands for testifying against his brother, break under the agony. It is revealed that the Roman seal on the fatal letter was a forgery. The officers Philocles and Apelles, who had been sent to Italy to find proof of treason, had been bought by the elder prince. The intricate details of the conspiracy are laid bare to the monarch. Philip learns that Demetrius never planned a coup. The letter that became his death warrant was a total fake. Philip had spent decades building intelligence networks and considered himself a master of intrigue. He believed he had outplayed the Senate. In reality, he had been completely played by his own son. The historian Justin writes that the monarch plunged into deep mourning, weeping for his innocent son and cursing Perseus. Polybius describes his condition even more harshly. According to him, Philip's mind snapped, and the Irenaeus, the Furies, spirits of the people he had murdered, descended to punish him for the blood he had spilled. Tormented by guilt, the king plans to strip Perseus of the crown, put him on trial, and hand the state over to a different successor. But the time the monarch had so ruthlessly stolen from others had now run out for him. It wasn't a sword wound, nor the poison of an assassin. Ancient chroniclers state clearly, the ruler's body simply gave out under the crushing weight of his mental anguish. In 179 BC, at the age of 59, the man who was once called the darling of the Hellenes dies. He leaves behind more than just an empty throne. Macedonia's arsenals are packed with weapons. Its vaults overflow with tons of silver. The army is highly trained, and the economy, restructured at the cost of oceans of blood, runs flawlessly. Philip V created a state perfectly primed for revenge against Rome. But to lead this country, he left a man whose lies would drag the ancient world into catastrophe. Philip V took the Macedonian crown as the greatest hope of Hellas, a young savior galloping through winter storms to aid his allies. And he went to his grave as a man who personally executed his own son. But here is the paradox. His empire was doomed long before the Roman legions tore through the Macedonian phalanx at Cynocephaly. Empires do not collapse from the blows of foreign swords. They crumble the very moment a ruler decides that the fear of his subjects is a more reliable tool than their loyalty. The massacre at Messenia and the death of Aratus became the exact point where Macedonia lost the Roman war before it even began. In trying to hold on to power by sheer force, the king himself opened the gates of his country to the enemy. However, history did not end there. New politicians were already marching to replace the Macedonian kings. On the horizon appeared a man who understood how to subjugate entire nations without open battle. His name was Titus Quinctius Flamininus. He wasn't a crude soldier, but a highly educated Roman who spoke to the conquered in flawless Greek. He brought with him a weapon that proved far more effective than war elephants and long sarissas, the political slogan of the freedom of Greece. And exactly how this illusion became the ultimate trap of ancient diplomacy, finishing off the independence of the Hellenic world, will be the topic of our next story. Subscribe so you don't miss the history of this clash. Hit the like button if the fate of the Macedonian king made you look at the price of absolute power in a new way. And leave a comment. Do you think Macedonia ever had a chance to withstand the Republic if Philip had maintained the loyalty of his allies? Thank you for being with us. See you next time.